Today we're going to be looking at the histogram. This is a tool that you'll see a great deal um, in photography. You'll see it in the back of your camera. You'll definitely see it in any kind of photo editor to help you analyze the work that you have done. So looking at the exposure can be a little confusing, and the histogram allows you to um, kind of glean some more information. And what I have found through the years is that many times students will be processing the images incorrectly. And the histogram helps you see kind of the patterns that you have. Um, some people prefer their images to um, on screen to be darker or more gray or more neutral. So a lot of kind of middle tone values versus some people prefer them to be really bright and light, which can give it a purposeful overexposure. So just looking at the image that on screen right now, and I'm gonna kind of expand my um, histogram here a little bit so you can see it better. So the histogram is up here on the upper right of your development panel. It also exists in the library. So it's in a few different places in Lightroom, and it's really important. I would highly suggest for students to start paying attention to the histogram when they're shooting, especially in bright sunlight on the back of the camera. So histogram, the way this one is set up, and you can have this set up in different ways. So sometimes right now the highlights are on the right hand side and the blacks are on the left hand side. Some people reverse this, or some programs reverse this, but this is the typical way to have it set up. So highlights are on the right and the blacks are on the left. So it's showing me in this ramp, um, the gray tones are the value. So this is the value kind of from light to dark, from highlight to shadow in your um, um, in your image. So center is a total neutral, and you can see as this makes sense, there's like a lot of value in the midtones here, where there's a little bit in the blacks and very little in the whites. And you'll notice when I hover over this, Lightroom segments this off, and you'll see this little kind of lighter gray box, and then it's showing me. So I've got my whites, I have my highlights, which are so true white is going to be devoid of texture, and highlights will be whites or lighter midtones that have some texture and value to them. Then you have your midtone, and then you have your shadows, which on the opposite, they kind of reflect what on the opposite end of what highlights are. So they might be perceived as dark midtones or blacks even, but they have texture in them. And the true blacks are not going to have a whole lot of texture within it. It's going to be um, it is going to be just kind of jet black. So I have very little of those in here. Now you'll notice these little triangles in the upper right and left corner. These are my gamut warnings. So these are going to tell me if I have anything that is out of gamut. It's actually okay to have some things that are out of gamut, and I'm going to pop on, I purposely left this photo in here. This is showing me that I have a lot of information in the whites that are out of gamut. So that red that you're seeing is wouldn't be able to be printed. And it's okay to have some of it. In fact, you do actually want to have a little bit of that in your photographs, but you don't want to have a ton. So that might be a little too bright, where an image like this that kind of stinks that I had no detail on the sky, but you know, it's still acceptable for printing. Now, something like this down here, that if we exclude the sky, this is much better. This is just a little bit of highlight, that's okay. Something like that is going to be too much. I wouldn't want to use that image necessarily. And then we can look at on the black end. So this one is actually, I'm surprised. I would have thought that I would have had more out of gamut in here. So this is actually really pretty nice, showing me that I have just a little bit of black that is true black and a little bit of white that's true white. So that's actually a pretty good image for print, which is one that I've already processed. So the blue, as you can see, is out of gamut black, and the white is out of gamut red. So when we're looking at our histogram, and it doesn't matter whether you want a really bright image or a really dark image, you do want to have information in your blacks and information in your whites. So you should have the full spectrum of value in every single photograph that you print. And I use print loosely in the sense that this also means publishing to the web. So this is just a proper exposure. So this, again, I do have a little bit of information. It doesn't go all the way to the right-hand side, but this is a pretty good image. It does tend, this photograph tends to be a little moody. It's darker. It has more darker values and gray values, but it does flow from one end of the spectrum to the other, which is really important. So this image is what we would call overexposed. And I'm going to turn my gamut warnings off so we don't have to look at those. This is just too bright of an image to print. So this is an improper exposure that is too bright, which is what we call overexposure. Let me see if I can find one that is too dark to print in this series. So that one's actually, this is an interesting one because at first glance, you might think that this image is too dark to print, but it is just a high contrast lighting. So I do have specular highlights that are illuminating the main subject, which is really nice. That one is not too dark of an image. So these, I tend to shoot a little bit brighter. So these are, perhaps this one I would consider underexposed, but that's fixable. So, but an underexposed image is an image that is photographed too dark and doesn't have enough light in it. Now with digital photography, and this is opposite from film photography and using negatives, it is better to have a slightly darker image than a brighter image. So something that's overexposed, especially extremely overexposed, like this image, is going to be really hard for me to fix in Lightroom. And you can see when I'm doing this that my whites are getting all blocked up and kind of looking gray, and it just looks like there's a cast over it. Where darker images, you have enough pixels that have detail in them that you can modify this image. And again, this image is just barely underexposed, so it's really definitely within the range of having a good photograph as far as looking at exposure is concerned. So when you're processing your images, you want to make sure that you have detail in your highlights and detail in your shadows. And that you do have true whites and true blacks. And it doesn't matter whether you have a bright and light looking image or a dark and moody image, you still need to have that spectrum. You might, if you notice when we look at this, there's not a huge ramp in the center of midtones. I have a lot of shadow and I have a little bit of highlight. That's perfectly acceptable. You have from shadow to highlight, which is perfect. Um, and kind of looking at on the other side of the spectrum, this is also a proper image and would print nicely, but it tends to be have heavier. There's definitely a huge ramp of gray or midtones, sorry, midtones in the center, and but still has black and white highlight and shadow present. So the very different mood of the image, but both have proper exposures for printing. The other thing I want to point out here is that we do have these colors that are in the background. This is also showing you the distribution of color. So this is a pretty well, it's a very monochromatic image. I actually removed all of the color and then added a split tone back in, which I'll teach you guys how to do later. But you'll notice that there's red, blue, and green are the three primary colors. That's actually the cones that we have in our eyes. So we have a cone to perceive red, we have a cone to perceive blue, and we have a cone to perceive green. So these colors that mix together, so red and blue mix, you'll see that little bit of magenta. And this is actually where green and red, when you're seeing yellow, green and red are overlapping. That's where you're seeing the yellow. So red light and green light mixed together make yellow, and blue light and green light make cyan. So those little, that little ramp right there is showing you where the cyan is, but that's really the green and blue mixing together. So you are getting some color information from your histogram as well. So you can see the different kind of ramping, but the main thing that you're trying to glean from the histogram is your value and your exposure. So again, this is a proper exposure, just not a lot of midtone. This is a little bit of a moodier image as well. So definitely pay attention to your histogram. Don't just use your eye because you'll end up making some mistakes when you're doing your processing. So I did want to cover the histogram before we talk about the basic panel. So I hope that helps.